Hello, women's writing students, and welcome back after the inter-session break. I hope you all had a bit of time off. I know it gets particularly busy somehow over the intra-session break, and you don't always get as much time as you would like, but I hope you did get some time off. I hope you're feeling a bit refreshed. We are very nearly there. We've only got 2 more texts on our unit and sort of 4 or 5 weeks to go. So hopefully you're holding up. It'll be good to see you all again on Wednesday. So this is our week 10 lecture pod. We're opening with Tasma's Monsieur Coloche, which is our one and only Australian short story from the 19th century on this unit. So hopefully you will enjoy reading the story, and hopefully we can begin to connect. I think is an important thing for the next couple of weeks. Begin to connect some of these stories together, because your final assessment, assessment 3, will be a comparative question, and you'll be working with the Gilman story, The Yellow Wallpaper, Gaskell's The Grey Woman, and Tasma's Monsieur Coloche. So you will have to write about 2 of those stories. So we will try to begin making some connections, and I think there are some obvious ones. I think with Tasma's story. So I'm going to jump in here with some of these slides so that you can see them as well. And as I always do when we start off with a new story, I'll just map out what I'm going to do in the 2 lecture pods that you will get for this particular story. So this week, for week 10, I want to talk a little bit about masculinity in colonial Australia. And those of you that came through approaches to text quite recently will hopefully remember some of this, actually, from when we were studying Barbara Bainton's short story, The Chosen Vessel, and that whole final module on the drover's wife. So some of you may be able to utilise some of that knowledge and some of that thinking for this particular story. And then next week I want to talk a little about, for week 11, I want to talk about cross-dressing and gender performance. And this is where I think we can make some really nice connections with The Grey Woman, because we've already talked a little bit about cross-dressing in that story with Amant and gender performativity. So there'll be hopefully some nice overlaps and some nice connections that you can begin to make across those 2 stories. So let's jump in here and begin thinking actually about the publishing context, because I actually think the publishing context for this story are also gendered, and there's a lot of rhetoric in the newspapers and in certain kinds of periodicals in Australia at the time that Tasma's short story is published that tell us quite a lot about masculinity in Australia. And we could say that the publishing contexts themselves are quite gendered in this time period. So I want to just start off with some of that. So I'm going to dive in here and just give you a bit of background to the publishing history of the story. Like all of our stories that we've been looking at, it originally appeared in a newspaper, a periodical called The Australasian, which is a Melbourne-based weekly newspaper, and it appeared in 2 parts. So in your unit reader and on readings, the reading and resources list on views, you'll see that the story is written in 2 parts, and that's because originally it was serialized in 2 parts. It was published first. The first part was published on 27th of April in 1878, and then in May, on the 4th of May, the following month, the second installment to the story was published. Like many of our other stories, this story also eventually was collected into book form with a number of other stories, and it was published under the title of A Sydney Sovereign and Other Tales by Tasma, and that came out sometime later, actually, in 1890. So that just gives you some background. Remember what we said about serialization, and remember what we talked about in terms of audience and our readership. We've talked about this for all of our stories, and we'll talk about it now for Tasma as well. But think about how we talked about how a story is crafted when it's crafted over multiple parts in a kind of serialized text, building up suspense, and thinking about how serialization actually affects how you might write a story. All of those conversations are deeply relevant to this thinking on this story too. So this is just an image here of the Australasian. This is actually the front page of the Australasian on 27th of April 1878. So the story was published in this particular edition, and you can see from the front cover that the newspaper's front cover was full of racing news and shipping news, and some advertisements as well. Now, the Australasian was a popular weekly newspaper as I say, that came out of Melbourne. And unlike some of the other newspapers and periodicals that would start to appear in the 1880s and the 1890s, the Australasian was less nationalistic than some of those other papers, I guess is the way I would put it, simplifying things a little bit, but that's one way of thinking of it. The Australasian was certainly deeply loyal to Australia's British colonial roots. At the same time, it was beginning to publish Australian stories like Tasma's Monsieur Coloche, but it took perhaps a more neutral stance, or a less kind of Republican stance, or a less nationalistic stance than some of the other newspapers. And it's worth looking ahead a little bit to what some of those newspapers and periodicals looked like, because I think what's happening in some of Tasma's stories is that she also is looking ahead to some of this. There are certain characters in the story who are what we would think of as kind of stereotypes or stock types, Australian national characters that have kind of come into the Australian political or social imaginary. Australian readers would have recognised these characters. They would have recognised people like Bog, these kind of self-made men, very kind of masculinist. And they would have recognised them because, as I say, there was a big kind of rhetoric in a number of Australian periodicals and newspapers. And Tasma's story looks ahead, I think, to some of the ways in which those stereotypes began to circulate more intensively as Australia led up to federation. So this particular magazine, as we might call it, rather than a newspaper, the Sydney Bulletin, started in January in 1880, so only a few years after Tasma's story. And this particular magazine was an advocate of really quite a radical Australian nationalism. And it's worth thinking a little bit about what that means, because I think some of the characters in Tasma's story are also kind of advocating a particular type of radical nationalism. So this is a quotation from Meg Trasker's essay on colonial nationalism in the period. And she says by the 1890s, the Sydney Bulletin was enshrined not only as the bushman's Bible, but the voice of an emergent Australian national identity. And this identity became notorious for its frequent expression of pugnaciously anti-English, nationalist, protectionist, masculinist, racist and or white Australian policies and attitudes. So something like the Sydney Bulletin really started to embody and advocate this kind of thinking. But I'm particularly interested in this idea of the magazine being the bushman's Bible. Who is the Australian bushman in the 19th century, and why is he reading this kind of magazine, or why is this magazine kind of appealing to this idea of this kind of very masculinized bushman figure, and how might that be related to someone like Sir Matthew Bogg in Tasma's story? So let's dive in here and think a little bit more about the story itself. And let's try to give ourselves a bit of a definition as well, I think, of this bushman figure. As I said before, I think some of you will be quite familiar with this figure. You may well have learned about this kind of thinking and these kinds of national stereotypes in high school. You may have studied Henry Lawson's The Drover's Wife, and hopefully you will certainly remember it from some of the discussion that we had in Approaches to Text. So I've taken a quotation from the critic Lindsay Murray, who gives us a little bit of an idea of what this kind of figure, this bushman figure, what he sort of represented, how he was a kind of national stereotype in Australia in the late 19th century. And she says that the bushman figure is a practical rather than theoretical man. He values physical prowess rather than intellectual capabilities. And you might want to think about that anti-intellectualism that we get right at the beginning of Monsieur Coloche. He is good in a crisis, but otherwise laid back. He is common and earthy, so he is intolerant of affectation and cultural pretensions. He is uninhibited in the pleasures of drinking, swearing, and gambling. And in the defence of men's interests, bushman masculinity was a very powerful image. A man existing among men and without broader social ties. And Sir Matthew Bogg is indeed a man amongst men, businessmen in the city of Melbourne, but also other kind of station hands and bush labourers and boundary riders in the larger kind of rural areas on the outskirts of Melbourne. A man existing among men without broader social ties. It's clear that he's not married in the story, neither does he have any children. The bushman's freedom could be celebrated in a spirit of nationalism as an Australian freedom, thereby legitimising men's social practices and masking the gender politics of the conflict. So a really kind of powerful definition there. And it's this idea of kind of bushman masculinity that I want us to begin thinking about and picking up on a little bit. And beginning to think about how Sir Matthew Bogg fits into, in some ways, into this stereotype, but also perhaps as someone that has gone beyond it, because of course Matthew Bogg, by the time that we meet him, is no longer a sort of, he starts off as a boat scrubber and a pig sticker, as it says in the story, and he's worked as a shopkeeper and a tradesman. He recalls his what he calls his grog shanty days, and his days as a station master, but now he's quite a refined, or at least he's living in kind of refined circumstances in the city rather than the bush. So it's worth thinking about the transition that we see across Sir Matthew Bogg's life. And it's maybe worth even asking ourselves the question, is there a crisis of masculinity going on with that particular character? Because certainly in the story, I think there's a gendered division between the rural Australia depicted in the story and the urban Australia, which is the township of Melbourne in the story. Part one of the story is set in the city, or the early colonial township of Melbourne, in the Bogg and Company offices on Flinders Lane. And this is a very kind of refined sort of environment. And we're even, Sir Matthew Bogg is described as someone who's kind of able to escape the heat and the dirt and the muck of a windy kind of hot day in Melbourne by driving through the streets in his covered kind of carriage and then stepping into the cool interior of the office. So he's someone that's kind of been taken out of an earlier kind of more rural working class life due to his own kind of wealth at this point late on in his life. Part two is set on one of Sir Matthew Bogg's sheep stations in the surrounding bushlands, and here we get a sense of that kind of men, a man among men, the kind of labouring rural bushman classes. These kinds of characters really do begin to embody that kind of masculine ideal that we've just been looking at. And so Matthew Bogg seems to be someone who's kind of caught in between these two places, caught in between these two parts of the story. So it's worth thinking about masculinity and how it's kind of depicted in these ways, and how the two parts of the story are also gendered. It's worth considering how we often think about nature as being feminine, Mother Earth, the idea of nature as a kind of feminine force or a female force, but that actually in the Australian context in the 19th century, it's largely associated with a kind of bush masculinity. The bushman reigns supreme in those rural kind of heartlands in Australia. So there's a kind of masculinization of nature in the Australian context, whereas the urban centre, as I say, is more cultured and refined. And again, we often think about culture and intelligence being associated with masculine, but there is a kind of an effeminacy that is associated with culture, particularly in the figure of Monsieur Coloche himself, the kind of man of letters, the kind of artist kind of coming into the city. So again, think about Sir Matthew Bogg and what he seems to represent. He seems to cut across these two things, bush masculinity, but a more kind of feminized, kind of urbanite figure. And we might want to think about how the story explores a certain kind of crisis of masculinity. Next week, we'll think a bit more about how the gender bending and the cross-dressing of the story plays even more with these gendered contexts. But for now, I want us to think a little bit about this kind of debate between nature and culture in part one and part two of the story. So looking forward to talking about this when I see you all on Wednesday.